So I compared the Nutritarian diet to like the starch-based vegan diet, and I showed that the Nutritarian diet gave sufficient protein and had that extra amount in there to accommodate athletes and the elderly. And that and I explained why I thought that this study and other studies showed there was some osteoporosis risk among vegans due to the combination of protein and calcium being somewhat low in the vegan diet not being well designed. The minute you start to eat greens and beans and nuts and seeds with lunch and dinner, and it's funny how even a little bit of beans and a little bit of nuts into the meal shoots it up, makes it balances it out right. It's really cool.
How much calcium do you recommend? And obviously, like you said, people on the standard vegetarian diet aren't appearing to getting enough, but on your Nutritarian diet, they can. How much do you recommend people get at least, or does it?
Yeah, I'm saying it. We're recommending people get, in that 750 to like 1,000 range or 750 to 1,200 range from food, a base calcium. And sometimes as calcium absorption and protein absorptions go down with age, I may give a person like 200 milligrams of food-based calcium with meals to just get it up a little higher, concerned about this person's osteoporosis risk. Because I take care of a lot of women who have osteoporosis, right? We don't give them a huge amount of calcium. We give them a little extra above the regular diet. And with, of course, impact train exercise. And we have a new piece of equipment in San Diego called the Lympha machine. It's LIMFA, and the LIMFA builds back bone. It actually restores bone mass in women. And we have the echo light REMs that we can, without radiation, we can check that the bone is actually building back and getting stronger. We do that so people aren't pushed into taking these bisphosphonates and other drugs that doctors give women that cause heart disease. I personally think those drugs shouldn't be on the market. They cause heart disease, heart deaths, atrial fibrillation. When you stop the drugs, you still have the heart damage from the drug. But in any case, we're suggesting that with osteoporosis, we treat it naturally, use regenerative therapies, which is a form of electromagnetic therapy that helps make with exercise, taking the osteoblasts to grow. And so I think, and we give them a little extra calcium. If you had the ideal diet where you're eating the bok choy and the sesame seeds and the kiwi, we could design a diet that's high enough in calcium without having to supplement a little bit. But, most women aren't eating that perfectly. So we give them a little extra usually.
So if a person's doing this and if they've corrected their diet that's been low in, let's say, the calcium over the years, without this machine, you're saying, is it still possible that they can rebuild the muscle? I mean,
Well,
the
you can
bone.
only,
I'm sorry, the bone.
yeah, you can rebuild muscle and bone with exercise. So the question is, and I have had very severe osteoporosis cases rebuild and restore bone mass before we had the machine, But they used a combination of they used the vibration from the power plate and heavy pulling, heavy lifting over short motion. In other words, what I mean by that is you don't like take a woman who's like has bone loss in her back and put a big, 100-pound dumbbell on her back, but we have her like stand over a bench and lift 30 pounds in each hand, but she's only lifting it off the bench 3 inches, 2 or 3 inches off the bench and putting it back down again.
Uh-huh.
And they can use the equipment where you're pushing against an isometric or a dynametric stress where they're putting a lot of pressure and hardly even moving and not bending over so far. So we use a combination of vibrational impact exercises and strength training to help build back muscle and bone. Because as you know, bone and muscle the strength builds together, and you lose muscle and bone strength together as we age. Losing some with aging is normal, but we resist that with exercise and with person. And because in America people do so many things wrong that
What
we
if
try
what
to.
if somebody's exercising a good amount, but they've been coming up short with their diet those years, but they still continue to exercise, but then they go on your diet and they start improving that. Is that like two thumbs up, like in terms of uh, regenerating what they lost because they're dealing with the cause, right?
Right, exercise plus the diet plus a little bit extra attention to the supplements, making sure their vitamin D is adequate and their calcium pushing their calcium in the favorable range. by diet and the judicious use of supplements if necessary. And we get results. But then the lymph machine adds more predictable results in a faster time frame. And,
What supplement would you recommend that's a safe calcium supplement for people if they were in that situation where they needed a little bit more?
well, our supplement called Osteobiotech, it uses food-derived calcium, but most calcium supplements have 500 to 750 of calcium per capsule. We have only about 200 milligrams of calcium per capsule. We don't want to give people too much. We want to give it a food because if you give too high a calcium, we don't want a spike of calcium in the blood. It can cause calcifications of soft tissue or calcifications in the heart. So we don't recommend high dose calcium. We're just adding a little food-based calcium to the meal. So bringing it up from like bringing the meal-based calcium up from 200 to 400, let's say, per meal. You know what I mean?
So the
So
source is
we're
food,
not
though.
pushing the calcium through the roof.
The source of the supplement is food.
The source of the calcium is food-based calcium, right? So it's the advantage to that is it's slower absorbed. We're not putting it's not as rapidly. So people say, "Oh, this is the most absorbable," but we don't want the most absorbable. We want things that are more slowly absorbed to duplicate what you get from food.
There was a fellow, Luigi Fontana, that did a study years ago about bone density amongst raw foodists. And
Uh-huh.
it turned out that they had lower bone density, but even though they had lower bone density, they weren't at a higher risk for fracture from their study. That was the results. What would you say to something like that? Do you think low bone density is the same across the board, or do you think there can be differences when it comes to this?
I don't think that study would have had enough people in it to be really accurate. But the answer to your question is yes, low bone density alone is not going to give you a fragility or a fracture risk score. That's why we have a scanner in our office called the Echolite REMS, which doesn't use radiation. And we can do it on kids who are like athletes. And. But the nice thing is we can repeat it without radiating a person. We can repeat it in 6 months to see if the bones are getting better, not weaker. And the nice thing about it is that the DEXA scan can be thrown off by osteophytes and osteoarthritic and disc disease and calcifications in the back. It can make it look and it but so the Echolite REMS that we use gives you a bone fragility score by analyzing the whole bone, the structure of the whole bone, not just the cortical bone, right? So it gives you a better. So we find some people that might be in the osteopenic range or osteoporotic range that are not at high fracture risk, and people. So the bone density is not a direct correlation with fracture risk. It has to do with your bone fragility score too. So we do measure that, and we can actually treat it.
So if somebody's in that situation, when are they since they're at less risk, is it concerning that they're in levels of osteopenia or osteoporosis, or is it not? Because the concern with osteoporosis, you're higher risk for fracture. But if you don't have
Yeah.
that risk, is there a concern with being in that low level?
It depends on the number and the severity. If you're right at the cusp between osteoporosis and osteopenia, yet your fragility score is good and your fracture risk is low, probably not a concern. Just stay active, keep yourself moving, and don't worry about it. But if your osteoporosis is severe, then you're probably not going to have a total normal fragility score. It'll probably not as bad, but you still should probably do something about it. It's based on the individual numbers.
In the study, they thought the reason why was the low body mass. That's why they were prone, or vegetarians or raw fooders were more prone to having the weaker bones because they had a lot less to carry. So they said a low BMI was one of the causes or reasons. Is that a possibility?
Of course, they said that in the OPIC expert study too, when they found that vegans had more osteoporosis. But in that study, the vegans had more hip fractures too. They had more fractures and more osteoporosis. And they said yes, they had lower body mass, but it was also that the calcium intake was low too. You know, and so the protein and my determination and looking at the in-depth analysis of that study show the diets these British vegans are following is not as good as a Nutritarian diet for bone protection in later life. I hire for the last 20 years. I have a full-time PhD researcher who works for me. Her name is Dina, and so I'll say, go get that study, get all the data, the raw data, see what the people were, go and she'll delve into all the data of all these studies to get the meat out of it. You know what I mean? And
Sure.
compare studies. If you look, the person asked me a question on flax seeds, I'm not answering them based on one study on flax seeds. We're evaluating 300 studies, every study on flaxseed ever done, and putting it all together because I have a full-time person who does nothing but that. They're just looking at the studies.
Sure. I think it's a big problem is a lot of, even with the 80-10-10 diet, they are looking at the protein. And even though they say 10%, at least they're looking at it. Where calcium, I don't think anyone on a raw food diet and very few people on a vegetarian diet are really monitoring that really well, knowing what they should get and knowing where to get it from. And if you're doing it from a raw food diet, I mean, leafy greens are the main source. I mean, to get a
Correct.
decent amount.
Right. And greens are not fruit.
Yeah.
And they're high in protein too.
And the problem I personally had over the years is my favorite green, or at least the most accessible green, was always spinach. Until I started growing collards and bok choy and these things, I used to spinach. And tell us about these. Spinach is not a great source of calcium because it has the oxalates. Is that correct?
Right, correct. The bok choy and the collards are the best.
So
Yeah.
I could have been doing
And bok
myself.
choy is so easy to grow. It doesn't get insects on
Yeah.
it or aphids and stuff. It's much cleaner. I don't get
So
slugs on it. And it grows so fast. I plant it and like 2 weeks later it's like amazing how I have different types of bok choy. I have red bok choy and baby bok choy and milk white bok choy and small. I have all these different bok choys in my garden.
So even somebody like myself eating a good amount of fat, a good amount of protein, but I could have been doing myself some serious harm from a calcium standpoint as green spinach being my major green until I got more into the sunflower sprouts and also into the bok choy and other greens.
Yeah, it's lucky you're not genetically a stone former because the too much spinach and the foods are spinach, Swiss chard, parsley, rhubarb, and beet tops. Those are the highest ones in oxalates. And you don't want to eat them raw. You mostly want to eat them cooked because it reduces the oxalates somewhat. So I don't recommend people put more than, let's say, 25% of their salad shouldn't be spinach, less than 25% or less. So you're having most of your greens have the full calcium bioavailable. And lettuce, by the way, has almost zero oxalic acid. The dark green lettuces are 100, the calcium is 100% absorbable.
What
So you
about the
chew them
light
really
green
well.
lettuce? What about light green lettuce?
Well, it's not going to be as rich as darker green lettuces, but
Sure.
as they head and get away from the sun. But
So
even
what
iceberg lettuce, you can eat the iceberg lettuce, pick it when it's young, before it heads too big, and you get a lot of green leaves, and it's still pretty good for you. People say, "Oh, this is the most absorbable," but we don't want the most absorbable. We want things that are more slowly absorbed to duplicate what you get from food.
Nature's wealth, good for your health. This is the Raw Life Health Show. Nature's wealth, good for your health. This is the Raw Life Health Show.